All right. Again, good morning, everyone. The title of our paper is Non-violencing, Reflections of Nonviolence Pedagogy with Lao Tzu and Deleuze in the Era of Pandemic. Our discussion today is based on an article that Seungho and I published recently, which is a cross-cultural conversation about the possibilities and potentials for nonviolence pedagogies. In our work, we begin from two different positions. Seungho working from Taoist tradition and myself working from European continental philosophy, specifically the works of Deleuze, to think about violence and nonviolence and how it is that we might craft a better and more powerful pedagogy around those things, around the idea of nonviolence. So our first move is to think about the opposition between nonviolence and violence. We know that violence takes many different forms and looks many different ways. It occurs in many different spaces and happens in a variety of forms. In turn, we consider that nonviolence is not simply the absence of violence, but nonviolence is distinct in and of itself. That nonviolence has particular qualities, that nonviolence seeks to preempt violence, that nonviolence attempts to address harm or repair injury that violence has caused, that nonviolence ultimately seeks to abolish the possibility of violence. And so we begin to try to open up and think about nonviolence as something more than just the absence of violence. By extension, we also begin to think that nonviolence is not a thing. Nonviolence is not a specific way of doing things. Nonviolence is not a specific particular method. This is important because in a similar way as that violence has many different forms that it can take, nonviolence has many different forms it can take. It's not a specific way of doing things, but instead it is an attempt, it is a way of imagining and thinking, a way of acting incisively in the world in order to preempt violence, address the harms that violence causes, and ultimately try to abolish the possibilities of violence. In turn, this leads us to our third step, which is to think about nonviolence as an active activity. To think about it as active, not simply a specific category, but an activity that people engage in the world. So we coined the term non-violencing. We consider nonviolence in its gerund form, non-violencing, to be a particular kind of activity performed to prevent violence in whatever relational patterns it may take. This open-ended space created by nonviolence facilitates imagining a fresh approach to human interactions and possibilities for education. I think about nonviolencing as active is thinking about it in its gerund form as a way of doing things. We begin to contrast it. We continue to contrast it with violence again. So where violence is no longer a consistent category of action, but rather a vast collection of specific actualizations of harm, which is made apparent from their effects. The range of concept here is so broad as to test the limits of the imagination, but it does allow us to discard the notion that human violence is primal, pre-existing, or essential, or a natural part of the world. Violence, rather, is a relation carried out in specific socio-political situation. So from this perspective, nonviolence is problematized as violence itself is situated in its specific context and becomes a form, an element of relationships. Nonviolence in turn becomes an active response to or an active attempt to preempt violence from being carried out in those relations. So to talk about this in a specific situation, here in the United States. To the left is an image of John Lewis being attacked by the police during a very famous voting rights march, nonviolent voting rights march across the Edmund Pettus Bridge on March 7th, 1965. Now, John Lewis was a leader of the civil rights movement in the 1960s and later became a congressman. He unfortunately passed away just a couple of weeks ago. But he'd become an important symbol of the civil rights movement, of the effort to create racial justice in the United States, and his work spanned his life. But this moment from when he was a young man involved with Dr. Martin Luther King, and a core part of the classical civil rights movement, is very famous in American history. And so here in the foreground, we can see him being beaten by policemen. He was part of one of the leaders of a large group who were trying to walk across the state to the Capitol to advocate for the right of African Americans to vote. And at this spot, the Edmund Pettus Bridge, state police stopped the march and attacked the marchers. And it was an important moment in the civil rights movement because it was broadcast on television and shocked many people who had previously didn't believe or were denied that such violent responses to nonviolent tactics took place. On the right here is John Lewis's funeral procession. So, some 55 years later, after John Lewis has passed, his funeral procession went over the same bridge, and you can see that there are rose petals strewn across the bridge, and a small procession following him, people in Black Lives Matter t-shirts, which at once represents to us how times change, that the nonviolent action that John Lewis and his colleagues took in 1965 were successful and did make change within the country. And so now he, 55 years later, he crosses the bridge as part of the same bridge where he was attacked. He crosses, being honored in death. But the people behind him wearing Black Lives Matter t-shirts still indicate that the nonviolent activity and strategies that were used during the civil rights movement weren't fully successful, that work continues, and that work continues to evolve and change in response to the times, that nonviolence, while still a consistent tactic that is being used to advocate for racial justice in the United States, it changes and evolves over time and in response to the conditions in which people find themselves. And so an example of that point, that nonviolence tactics change and evolve over time, this is an image of the wall of moms from Portland, Oregon, just a couple of weeks ago. Those who followed the news closely in the United States will know that Portland, Oregon became a flashpoint, a center for intense protests against the federal government and for Black Lives Matter, for racial justice over the past few weeks. And one of the tactics that emerged there is that a number of women, a number of moms, would go into the streets in the evening during the protests, dress themselves all in yellow, and act as a barrier or a shield between police officers and federal agents and the mass of protesters. And so these women were self-identifying as moms, using a specific color to identify themselves, and then acting as that shield to protect others behind them. And then further, because many of these moms, even a majority of these moms, were white, they were also using some of their own racial privilege to act as that shield as well. As a sort of creative nonviolent strategy, these women were drawing on sort of the innocence and mythology of motherhood, but also their white racial privilege, to try to create a barrier which would promote nonviolence, which would allow for nonviolent protests to happen behind them and prevent the police from being aggressive with them or using violent tactics against the protest. So to us, this reflects sort of a new and interesting nonviolent tactic which has emerged in the current moment.
Hello, everyone. My name is Seungho Moon. I'm So glad that I'm part of this discussion, and I want to invite you to take a moment to remember, in the US, we remember, all these people and victims of this institutionalized racism. And I want to invite you to have like 15 seconds to remember these people as well as the unknown victims due to the institutionalized racism around the world. Let's take 15 seconds to just remember those victims. Welcome back. Actually, Charlie and we created a term of non-violencing to challenge a normalized understanding about non-violence education, because usually we list the things to do or not to do, and we realize that this kind of educational practice doesn't help to change a society. So intellectually, we try to theorize the meaning of, what is the real actions and what we can do intellectually. So we invented this term nonviolence in pedagogy, as a distinct discourse for revisiting nonviolence education amid the political and social cultural climate of generating harmful acts against the common good. So, as a real practice, we highlight the value of indigenous knowledge, such as Taoism and Wu Wei in this practice, and also Deleuzean ideas in extending conversations about nonviolence pedagogy. So embracing multiple perspectives with open-endedness is a great practice of nonviolence in this particular presentation, because we believe that it minimizes any epistemological violence due to legitimizing a particular set of knowledge, particularly from the Eurocentric perspectives. Well, we do not seek to unmoor nonviolence from questions of morality, ethics, and justice. Instead, we attempt to open a new avenue for nonviolence education by posing nonviolencing as a concept. So we believe this introduces elements of indeterminacy and unexpectedness into the efforts toward nonviolence, which create new grounds for examining our intention and learning about nonviolence movement in the past and the present, particularly within this Black Lives Matter in the US. So I want to challenge the concept of, in the US at least, there is a conservative group to insist that, well, Black Lives Matter really underestimates all lives matter. And this is one of the examples of, to question, who is excluded from saying all. And I go back to the foundations of the, claim. Jefferson says all men are created equal, right, in the 18th century, but we still exclude all, some groups of people by saying all. You know that historically Thomas Jefferson had slaves. So this is an issue of, how we can challenge this paradox of when you say all, definitely it excludes some people. For example, in the second wave feminist movement, when people say, well, women's rights, and conservative, feminist group, they exclude LGBT communities. So I want to problematize the meaning of all within this current political movement. And the next slide, I just cited, Charlie, if you can click the under control, and there will be a political cartoon that I want to share with you. I believe that some of you know this cartoon already by Brian Stafford. This is an image that President Trump is wearing a mask, not covering his mouth, but covering his eyes. And as a side note, I go back to I Ching, particularly hexagram 20. So this is what I meant to say of Brian Stafford's Under Control. And as part of this nonviolence in pedagogy, I try to see how to go back to some of the different intellectual traditions like I Ching and the hexagram 20 Quan. Quan is to contemplate or to observe. And with this hexagram, I Ching says the wind blows over the earth. Quan, thus the wise kings visited the people's world, see the people, and then give them lessons. I want to invite you to think about what is the meaning of sage leadership amid this challenging time. And now this epidemic becomes more political issues. And in the US, because of November election, many critics say that there are some challenging issues, more challenging issues of people are geared toward getting votes rather than mitigate any kind of virus. I want to just go back to this I Ching's wisdom to look at how to define the meaning of sage leadership.
All right. So concurrently with Seungho's thinking from the I Ching, I think from the work of Gilles Deleuze, who was a late 20th century French post-structuralist philosopher, and Deleuze characterized himself as a philosopher of life, and really someone who tries to think about the emergence of life and the emergence of issues in the world, and how life continues and how life prospers. As I begin to approach violence and non-violence, I think from the Deleuzian vantage point that concepts are always in development as they affect and arrange relationships in the world. Deleuze argues that instead of determined prefixed forms populating the world, things are always in a continual state of becoming. That is, everything is in motion, everything is moving towards becoming something that it is not at the moment. It is not yet. And so as everything in the world moves towards becoming something else, we try to use concepts to get an understanding of how the world functions and how the world works. But we also want to resist any preset ideas, any static, received, or transcendental notions about what violence is or what non-violence might be. We want to be keenly attentive to the world. We want to be sort of radical empiricists to really understand how things are changing, how things are becoming in the world. And so this processual sense of change that is always in the middle of reorganizing connections is characteristics of the very production of events. That the world in which we live and the events which occur in the world are part of a longer and deeper process of change, which is constant, and the world is becoming something new, something different, something that it is not yet. Further, Deleuze posits that since becoming is constant, that the change of particular elements of a situation bring about a new situation, which is in itself a process of becoming something else. So inspired by the Deleuzian notion of becoming, we theorize that non-violencing is a haexiety, and that's the emergent individuation in the continual flow of events without prediction. So Deleuze draws this notion of haexiety from the 16th and 17th philosopher Duns Scotus. The idea that events emerge from the activities of the world, that events are not preordained, that events are not caused by single and individual actions, but that events emerge from the world in which they're a part of. And in this process of becoming, we take this notion of haexiety, that the world, that events are fluid and that they emerge, that is part of the process of becoming. Events and activities emerge from the world. We think about the fluidity of events and whether violent or non-violent, they create a non-anchored notion of thisness. So when we're thinking about the very specifics of what a violent action might be, or thinking about what a non-violent activity might be, what a non-violent action might be, we try to think about events as they are becoming and as they are emerging, and that non-violence will emerge from the activity and the event that they are part of. That there is not a transcendental, preordained notion of what non-violence is, but non-violence emerges from the situation in which it is occurring.